Horror films have been scaring and disgusting audiences since the 1900s, though they aren't films for everyone. The best are quite effective at targeting just what disturbs an audience most, playing on deep and natural fears and exploiting them to their best use. One such fear that was most popular among horror films in the 60s and 70s were what we'll call evil mothers. That is to say, mothers who manipulate their children, treat them harshly, or ignore them to the point of detriment and are ultimately blamed for their child's murderous actions. This kind of archetype has shown itself in classics like Psycho, where Mrs. Bates plays the role of a domineering and judgmental off-screen presence that looms over every evil deed committed by her son as the source of it.
And in the end, he intended to tell them I killed those girls and that man, as if I could do anything except just sit and stare.
Other icons of horror motherhood include Margaret from Carrie and Other Mother from Coraline, who are all portrayed as villains of their child's story. In this way, mothers in the horror genre have historically been represented as the primary source of villainy and fear, even if they aren't the ones stabbing people. This portrayal has given way to an interpretation that explores fear through the perspective of the mother, showing their struggles with expectations of motherhood, grief, and how those manifest themselves into anger. This contemporary interpretation is exemplified best through 3 horror films: The Babadook, Hereditary, and Goodnight, Mommy. But before I prove this, a quick summary. Let's start with The Babadook. This film follows Amelia, a single mother to her son Samuel, struggling to provide for him while grieving for her recently deceased husband. Amelia's relationship with her son is complicated by the nature of her husband's death, wherein he died in a car crash as they were driving to the hospital for her to give birth. After Amelia discovers a cursed book titled The Babadook, the two are soon haunted by an entity from this book who eventually Amelia is possessed by. However, the film ends on a good note after the two defeat this entity, but must still feed it as it is not entirely gone. In Hereditary, the film starts by introducing Annie, a successful artist whose secretive mother has just passed away. Gradually, the film starts to uncover that Annie's mother was the head of a cult who wants to use her son, Peter, as a bodily host for their god. After her daughter Charlie's death, Annie is manipulated by this cult into killing her husband and eventually being possessed by this god and killing herself. Pretty bleak, but on brand for Ari Aster. Lastly, Goodnight, Mommy is about 2 twin boys named Elias and Lucas along with their unnamed mother. She's just come back from cosmetic surgery and has bandages covering most of her face. After she becomes seemingly and uncharacteristically harsh on them, the twins begin to suspect that she isn't their real mother. They become hostile towards her, tying her up on her bed, holding her captive until they eventually burn her down along with the house. Before the film ends, we find out that Lucas had drowned in a lake before the major event of the film took place. His appearance had been imagined by Elias throughout the entire film, while the mother had decided out of pity to play along for most of it. There, now that you have the gist of these 3 films, let's dive into how their mothers function. Modern horror mothers, as opposed to their historical counterparts, are shown struggling with the expectations of motherhood placed on them by the oh-so-notorious hands of society, and more specifically, gender norms. It is a given as a mother to be expected to be the perfect one. Promises that include fulfillment as a woman, natural gravitation to the labor of raising a child, and more sugar-coated ideals. And say you were to reject any of these ideals, you'd be labeled a bad mother. While older horror films use this label as a way to paint the mother in a villainous light, our 3 films expose the inherent issues with it. Let's start with Amelia, who has, at best, a complicated relationship with her son, Samuel. She tries her best to love and take care of him by herself, but struggles with her simultaneous contempt for him. She secretly blames Samuel for the death of her husband, but due to pressure from her friends and neighbors to essentially get over it and be a good mother, she feels she can't express it.
It'll be 7 years. Isn't it time you moved on?
I have moved on. I don't mention him. I don't talk about him.
Some friends, huh? But it isn't just them, it's anger and judgment from Annie's family in Hereditary that constantly urges her to suppress her grief and relationship with her own mother. It's the villainization of cosmetic surgery from Elias in Goodnight, Mommy that portrays vanity as incompatible with this aforementioned ideal of motherhood. Though it may be cliché to say, gender norms and repressive maternal expectations are the true villains of these films. They trap the mother with nowhere to turn, left not only to live with the subject of their torment, but to take care of them and nurture them. This leads me to my next point. when the mothers in these films experience grief. In older horror films, grief isn't something that the mother goes through, or at least it isn't something they're shown to be going through, as the mothers are meant to be the ones inflicting grief on their children, their victims. Think Carrie, wherein dear Mother Margaret acts as a constant source of repression for her daughter, the driving aspect of her daughter's eventual outburst. Though, a common denominator among our more contemporary horror films is that the mothers are allowed to go through their own grief, not allowed by the ones around them maybe, but by the lens of the film itself. This mourning is shown to affect both mother and child concurrently, and does so without attempting to excuse the sometimes horrible acts they do to each other. This grief manifests itself in different ways throughout the films. In the Babadook, the ghost of the Babadook itself is a physicalization of Amelia's grief and trauma from losing her husband. Annie's dollhouse-like artworks from Hereditary become representative of her need to cope with her mother's death and abuse, as well as her daughter's death. And in Goodnight, Mommy, the mother's bandages on her face are a manifestation of her grief over the death of her son Lucas, as well as her loneliness. These manifestations also act as an isolator for the mother, provoking Amelia's disdain for her son, causing Annie to lock herself in her studio, and causing Elias to consider his mother an imposter. Out of this conflict between expectations and grief emerges the breaking point of the mother's repression, only to give way to one thing: anger. Finally, out of the repression of expectations of motherhood along with grief, sprouts anger. This stage in the mother is one that's heavily exploited in older horror films in order to omit relatability to the audience. This usually makes for a downright scary antagonist. No one likes to see a mother furious with her child, especially not to the point of violence. What this does, however, only serves to emphasize the scariness of motherhood in films that alternatively portray it. It's as if the older films are saying, there's nothing scarier than an angry mother because she rejects everything that makes her a mother. However, when motherhood is portrayed from the mother's perspective, it becomes clear that they are the ones trapped in this expectation with the knowledge that they will be villainized if they express their feelings. Eventually, all that repression builds up into a wave of stark, irreversible anger, which is exemplified best in our three films. In both Goodnight, Mommy and Hereditary, this anger is brought to light near the middle, and in the Babadook, the end. Interestingly enough, the three films give quite alternate yet eerily similar outcomes to this anger. The Babadook depicts the mother attempting to kill her child, Hereditary the mother killing herself, and Goodnight, Mommy the child attempting to kill the mother. Now, because they're horror films, these outcomes are quite exaggerated to the point of murder, but this is by design. It is indeed a horror for a general audience to witness a mother and child trying to kill each other, but in a way that neither blames nor excuses either of them. A horror film offers a space that no other film can. It's one where mothers are allowed to break out of their boxes and say that they hate raising their child, that they don't feel all the fulfillment they were promised as a mother, and that they feel angry. This is meant to be scary to an audience who hasn't seen the build-up to this moment, but to an audience who has, it's an entirely different scenario. The most important thing we can glean as an audience from these contemporary horror films is that a mother's story shouldn't be made any less important than the child's, as there is value in determining the reason for it. We see the build-up behind Amelia's inner conflict as she grapples with the new responsibilities of being a single mother, as well as how much she hates it. And since the film's horror outlet gives this conflict a name and a face, we are brought along for the ride. Annie feels she has to hide her visits to grief counseling and has an inner blame for her son that constantly eats at her. We see her plunge into madness because of this, and we can't help but feel that it isn't her fault. And the nameless mother in Goodnight, Mommy, though much less responsive than the other two, is only looking for a fresh start, a wanting to feel beautiful and start anew after the death of her son. But only after this is revealed do we see her needlessly tortured and killed by her own child. And we know she isn't an imposter. Like this, our perception of these women breaks the black and white nature of their previous representation in media. You either get a good, determined mama bear who will do anything to save her child, or a horror with a maniacal villain who deserves no redemption. They are now made into three-dimensional characters with disturbingly real reasons for their actions, reasons that suppress them to a breaking point and which have value in being told. In fact, this realism makes it all the more scary to watch. And that, my friends, is how to make an effective horror film. Thanks for listening.